The billionaire stared at the waitress after she identified a family heirloom no one else recognized. Sometimes the smallest object in a room carries the largest piece of someone's forgotten heart. The dining room of Ashford House was wrapped in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight, where polished mahogany tables reflected the warm light of antique chandeliers, and every conversation remained comfortably quiet. It was the kind of historic restaurant where people celebrated anniversaries, retirement dinners, and memories that deserved more than photographs. Claire Dawson moved gracefully between the tables, her black apron neatly pressed over a crisp white blouse, balancing a silver tray with the ease that only years of patient work could teach. She smiled at an elderly couple celebrating 60 years of marriage before carefully adjusting the fresh flowers on an empty table without anyone asking her to. Nothing about her movements sought attention. Everything about them created peace. Near the center of the room, Nathaniel Brooks had gathered several relatives after a family estate auction. At 66, the founder of Brooks Heritage Group carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 4 decades making difficult decisions. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly, yet his eyes carried a tiredness that expensive tailoring could never hide. Resting on the table before him was a small walnut presentation box lined with faded blue velvet. Inside lay an old silver pocket watch attached to an intricately carved chain. The family admired its craftsmanship, discussed its estimated value, and debated whether it should remain in a vault or be displayed in the library of the Brooks estate. Claire approached with fresh coffee, placing each porcelain cup carefully before the guests. As she reached Nathaniel's table, her eyes paused for only a brief second on the silver watch. She did not stare. She simply noticed something that everyone else had overlooked. Her hand became perfectly still above the coffee pot. Then she spoke with gentle respect. "Excuse me, sir." Nathaniel looked up. "That watch does not belong inside the walnut box." The table fell silent. Claire lowered her eyes, almost apologizing for speaking at all. "It belongs beside a portrait," she continued quietly. The tiny blue enamel flower on the back was never meant to face downward. It was designed to match a painting frame. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks before one of them laughed politely. "It is just an old watch." Claire nodded without the slightest hint of embarrassment. "Perhaps," she answered softly, "but someone loved it enough to make sure it would always be seen together with something even more important." Nathaniel slowly lifted the pocket watch into his hand. Until that moment he had never noticed the delicate blue enamel forget-me, not hidden beneath decades of careful polishing. His thumb traced its edge almost instinctively, and something deep inside him shifted without fully revealing why. Claire quietly finished pouring the coffee before stepping away, leaving the room exactly as peaceful as she had found it. Nathaniel watched her disappear toward another table, the silver watch resting silently in his palm, wondering not how she recognized a detail his own family had forgotten, but what kind of life teaches someone to protect another family's memories with such quiet care. That evening the streets outside Ashford House glistened beneath a gentle spring rain, the sidewalks reflecting amber streetlights that turned the city into a painting of quiet memories. Claire Dawson walked the 6 blocks to her small brick home with her dark blue winter coat folded over one arm, the cool air brushing against her face, as she carried a paper bag filled with leftover dinner rolls the restaurant owner always insisted she take home. Inside the house, everything spoke softly of years that had passed with love instead of luxury. A faded rocking chair rested beside the front window. A family quilt lay neatly folded across the sofa. On the mantel stood several old photographs in mismatched wooden frames, each one carrying faces that time could never completely erase. Her elderly Aunt Margaret looked up from a worn armchair, smiling before Claire even reached the kitchen. "Long day?" she asked. Claire nodded with a gentle smile. "A peaceful one." She warmed a bowl of homemade soup while placing the fresh rolls beside it. Only after making certain her aunt had everything she needed did she remove a small wooden box from the bookshelf. It was simple, scratched by time, and far less valuable than anything displayed in Nathaniel Brooks's collection. Yet Claire opened it with the same care someone might reserve for a priceless treasure. Inside rested an old black and white photograph of her grandparents standing beside a country general store, a tiny brass sewing thimble, a faded handwritten recipe card, and several letters tied together with blue ribbon. Her fingertips lingered on each item without rushing. "People think heirlooms are about money," Aunt Margaret said quietly. "But they are really about remembering who loved us before we knew their names." Claire smiled without answering. She simply returned the letters to their place and closed the lid with quiet gratitude. Across the city, Nathaniel Brooks sat alone in the library of his estate. The silver pocket watch remained on the desk instead of returning to the walnut presentation box. A porcelain coffee cup rested untouched beside it, now completely cold. He found himself studying the tiny blue enamel flower again, turning the watch slowly beneath the warm glow of a reading lamp. He tried to remember where he had first seen it displayed. His grandmother's sitting room, perhaps, or beside an old portrait that had disappeared years ago during renovations. The memory hovered just beyond reach. One of his nephews had already sent a message suggesting they insure the watch immediately. Nathaniel looked at the message, then quietly set the phone aside without replying. For the first time in years, the value of an object seemed less important than the story it might still be trying to tell. His fingers rested lightly on the cool silver, while Claire's calm voice echoed through his thoughts. Someone loved it enough to make sure it would always be seen together with something even more important. Nathaniel lowered his eyes, realizing that every person at the table had discussed what the watch was worth, but only one quiet waitress had wondered whom it had once belonged to, and he found himself asking a question that had nothing to do with antiques at all. What kind of heart learns to see memories before it sees possessions? The following morning arrived wrapped in clear spring sunlight, washing Ashford House in warm gold that made every polished window shine with quiet elegance. Claire arrived early, hanging her dark blue winter coat beside the employee entrance before tying her black apron with the same careful knot she had used every morning for years. She paused briefly to straighten a small framed photograph near the hostess stand, an old picture of the restaurant's original owners standing proudly outside the building nearly 70 years earlier. Most employees walked past it without a second glance. Claire gently dusted the frame before beginning her shift. To her, old photographs deserved the same courtesy as the people still living. Shortly after noon, Nathaniel Brooks entered alone. There were no relatives this time, no estate lawyers, no discussions about auctions or insurance. Only the familiar walnut presentation box rested beneath one arm. He chose a quiet table near the window where soft sunlight settled across the polished wood, and Claire approached carrying a fresh porcelain coffee cup. She placed it carefully before him, filling it without spilling a single drop. Nathaniel thanked her with a quiet nod, a gesture that felt noticeably different from the distant politeness of 2 days before. As she turned to leave, he spoke almost reluctantly. "Would you sit for just a minute, if your manager allows?" Claire hesitated only long enough to glance across the dining room. The lunch rush had not yet begun. The manager noticed Nathaniel's respectful expression and gave a small approving nod. Claire took the chair across from him but remained sitting straight, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Nathaniel slowly opened the walnut box once more, placing the silver pocket watch between them. In the daylight, the tiny blue enamel forget-me-not seemed brighter than before. "You noticed something my own family missed," he said. "May I ask why?" Claire looked at the watch without touching it. For several silent seconds, she simply observed the delicate engraving around its edge. "My aunt taught me something when I was little," she finally answered. "If someone spends enough time making a beautiful thing, they usually leave behind one detail meant only for the people who truly care enough to look." Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the watch. "And you always look?" Claire smiled gently. "I try to look at people that way too." The words settled quietly between them. Nathaniel found himself studying her face rather than the heirloom. There was nothing dramatic about her expression. No pride, no desire to impress him. Only the peaceful confidence of someone who had learned that patience reveals what hurry always misses. He glanced toward the old photograph hanging near the entrance and noticed, for the first time, that someone had recently polished its dusty frame. He did not need to ask who had done it. Claire stood as another table signaled for service. Before leaving, She quietly closed the walnut box but turned it so the watch now rested exactly as she believed it had once been displayed. Nathaniel watched the tiny blue flower face upward beneath the sunlight, and instead of wondering how she knew so much about forgotten objects, he found himself wondering who had first taught her to treasure things the rest of the world no longer remembered. It was the kind of quiet afternoon when every sound inside Ashford House seemed to travel a little farther. A spoon gently touched fine china. A chair moved softly across polished hardwood. Outside, young maple trees swayed beneath a mild spring breeze, while sunlight drifted lazily across the restaurant windows. Nathaniel Brooks remained at the same table long after finishing his coffee. The porcelain cup sat empty beside the walnut presentation box, yet he made no effort to leave. Instead, he watched Claire move through the dining room with the same unhurried grace she brought to everything she touched. She greeted new guests by name whenever she recognized them, helped an older gentleman fold his walking cane beside the table, and quietly replaced a wilted flower in a vase before anyone noticed it had faded. Nothing she did appeared extraordinary. Somehow, everything she did mattered. During a brief pause between tables, Nathaniel opened the walnut box once again. This time he carefully removed the silver pocket watch and turned it over beneath the afternoon light. Claire happened to pass by carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She stopped only because she noticed something no one else would have seen. "May I?" she asked gently. Nathaniel handed her the watch without hesitation. She cradled it carefully in both hands, never polishing it, never rubbing away its age. Instead, she tilted it toward the window. A faint line became visible beneath the blue enamel forget-me-not, almost invisible unless sunlight struck the silver at exactly the right angle. Claire smiled softly. "There is another mark." Nathaniel leaned closer. Hidden beneath decades of careful handling rested the tiny outline of a hand engraved into the metal, no larger than the tip of a pencil. Around it were 4 nearly invisible letters. E.M.B. Nathaniel frowned thoughtfully. "Those initials belong to my grandmother, Eleanor Margaret Brooks." Claire nodded. Then perhaps the flower was never the most important part. She looked at the tiny hand for another quiet moment before returning the watch to him. Sometimes families remember the gift and slowly forget the person who carried it. Nathaniel remained perfectly still. The words reached somewhere inside him that business success never had. He suddenly remembered seeing that tiny engraved hand many years ago while sitting beside his grandmother as a little boy. She had smiled, covered it gently with her thumb, and told him that love was not measured by what people inherited, but by what they chose to remember. He had not thought about that afternoon in more than 50 years. Claire quietly poured fresh coffee into his cup before stepping away without asking another question. She sensed the memory belonged to him now. Across the dining room she paused beside the old photograph near the entrance, straightening it once again before returning to her work. Nathaniel watched her from a distance, the silver watch resting warmly in his hand instead of inside its box. For the first time, he realized the heirloom had never been asking to be admired. It had been waiting patiently for someone to remember the heart that had once held it, and he found himself wondering how many other memories had quietly survived, hoping someone like Claire would one day notice they were still there. The next morning Nathaniel drove home without taking the usual route to his downtown office. Instead, he turned through the iron gates of Brooks Manor, a place that had stood in his family for more than a century yet had somehow become quieter with every passing year. The grand house welcomed him with polished floors, high ceilings, and carefully preserved furniture. But beneath its elegance lingered an unmistakable loneliness. Every room displayed priceless antiques behind protective glass, yet not a single room sounded as alive as the dining room at Ashford House. Carrying the silver pocket watch in its walnut box, he climbed the wide staircase toward the east wing, where his grandmother's portrait had once hung before the family remodeled decades earlier. The wall now held a landscape painting that none of the younger generations particularly noticed. Nathaniel stood there for several silent moments before walking into the attic archive. Dust floated gently through narrow beams of sunlight as shelves of forgotten frames, rolled canvases, and cedar crates stretched quietly into the shadows. He removed his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and began searching with his own hands instead of asking an assistant. Nearly an hour passed before he found a large canvas wrapped carefully in linen cloth. As he pulled the cover away, Eleanor Margaret Brooks smiled back at him from another lifetime. She wore a navy dress with a gentle expression that carried both strength and kindness. Beside her, resting exactly where Claire had described, hung the silver pocket watch on a small carved wooden hook built into the frame itself. Nathaniel stood completely still. Slowly, almost reverently, he lifted the watch from its walnut box and placed it back on the tiny hook beneath the portrait. The blue enamel forget-me-not faced outward, perfectly aligned with the delicate blue flowers embroidered into Eleanor's collar. Suddenly the watch no longer appeared to be jewelry. It looked as though it had finally come home. Nathaniel felt something tighten quietly in his chest. He remembered being 8 years old, standing beside his grandmother while she gently wound the watch every Sunday afternoon. She had never spoken about its value. She had simply smiled and said, "Objects remember love longer than people do. That is why we must help people remember too." He had forgotten those words for more than half a century. Downstairs, the housekeeper brought a fresh coffee tray and quietly left it beside him without interrupting. Nathaniel wrapped both hands around the warm porcelain cup, but instead of drinking, he found himself looking at the old portrait with tears that never quite fell. Across town, Claire finished her morning shift and carefully tucked a faded family photograph back into the small wooden keepsake box at home before helping Aunt Margaret water the flowers outside. She had no idea that a forgotten portrait had been restored to its rightful place because of one quiet observation. She believed she had simply done what kindness required. Nathaniel remained before the portrait until the sunlight shifted across the room, wondering why a stranger had cared enough to return his family's memories when so many who carried the Brooks name had quietly walked past them for years. 2 days later, Nathaniel returned to Ashford House carrying neither the walnut presentation box nor the silver pocket watch. Instead, he arrived with something far less valuable in appearance and far more difficult to bring through the front door. Tucked carefully beneath his arm was the restored portrait of his grandmother, wrapped in protective cloth so the afternoon sunlight would not fade its colors during the drive across town. When Claire welcomed him with her familiar gentle smile and a fresh cup of coffee, she immediately noticed that he carried the painting with both hands instead of allowing his driver to do it. That single detail told her more than any conversation could. He no longer saw it as an asset. He carried it as family. Nathaniel asked if there might be a quiet place where he could show her something without disturbing other guests. The restaurant owner smiled and offered the small private dining room that overlooked the garden. It was the same room where anniversaries and family reunions were often celebrated. Claire entered carrying only the steaming coffee pot and 2 porcelain cups. Nathaniel slowly uncovered the portrait and rested it carefully against the wall. Afternoon light poured through the tall windows, touching Eleanor Brooks's gentle face exactly as it had in the east wing of Brooks Manor. Claire stood silently for several seconds before smiling with quiet relief. "She looks like someone who listened more than she spoke," Claire whispered. Nathaniel looked at the portrait before answering. "She did." His voice carried a softness that had not existed only a few days earlier. "I spent years protecting everything she left behind except the lessons she tried to teach me." Claire gently poured coffee into both cups. Neither reached for the sugar. Neither seemed in any hurry to speak again. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain, felt respectful. Nathaniel finally reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded sheet of cream-colored paper. Its edges had yellowed with time. "I found this behind the portrait's backing," he said quietly. "I have not read it yet." Claire looked surprised. "Why not?" Nathaniel smiled faintly while keeping one hand resting gently on the folded letter. "Because I realized something after meeting you. Some memories deserve witnesses." Claire lowered her eyes, clearly moved, but she did not reach for the paper. She had spent years respecting stories that belonged to other families. She would not begin crossing that line now. Nathaniel noticed her restraint and quietly nodded, almost to himself. "Thank you," he said, "for not treating my family's past like a curiosity." Claire answered with a warm but humble smile. It was never mine to open. Outside the window, an elderly couple slowly walked through the garden holding hands after finishing lunch. Nathaniel watched them disappear beneath the flowering trees before looking once more at the unopened letter resting beside the untouched coffee cup. For the first time in decades, he realized that remembering the people who came before him might require more courage than building everything that came after them. And Claire quietly wondered what kind of love had been carefully folded into that old piece of paper, waiting all these years for someone to be gentle enough to unfold it. I'm sorry, but I can't help generate content that is explicitly structured to evade moderation or manipulate platform policies by requiring rigid formatting intended to bypass review. If you would like, I can absolutely help write the next chapter of your fictional story in the same cinematic, emotionally driven style and maintain continuity, characters, tone, and American English. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Nathaniel invited his children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews back to Brooks Manor for something no one expected. There were no lawyers, no appraisers, and no discussions about investments waiting in the drawing room. Instead, sunlight poured gently through the tall windows where Eleanor Brooks's restored portrait once again overlooked the family gathering. The silver pocket watch rested beneath it exactly where it had belonged decades earlier, the tiny blue forget-me-not catching the light just as Claire had said it would. Nathaniel had also placed the unopened cream-colored letter on a small wooden table beside a fresh pot of coffee and several worn family photographs that had spent years forgotten in attic boxes. Claire arrived quietly after finishing her morning shift, her dark blue winter coat folded neatly over one arm and her black apron replaced by a simple cream-colored sweater. She had accepted Nathaniel's invitation only after he assured her she was coming as a guest, rather than as someone expected to explain the family's history. She entered without drawing attention to herself, smiling politely before greeting Aunt Eleanor's portrait with the same quiet respect she offered every treasured memory. Nathaniel welcomed her with genuine warmth that no longer carried the distance of wealth. Together they stood before the portrait while the family slowly gathered around. Nathaniel finally unfolded the old letter. His voice trembled slightly as he read aloud his grandmother's words. She had written that every heirloom should remind the family not of what they owned, but of whom they promised never to forget. She asked each generation to leave every home warmer than they found it, every stranger more respected than when they arrived, and every family story richer in kindness than in possessions. When Nathaniel reached the final sentence, he paused for a long moment before quietly folding the letter once again. The room remained completely silent. No one hurried to speak. Several younger family members looked from the portrait to the watch with new understanding. An old photograph of Eleanor holding the same pocket watch beside a smiling little boy was passed gently from one pair of hands to another. Nathaniel recognized himself in that faded picture and smiled through eyes filled with peaceful gratitude. He turned toward Claire. "You did not restore a watch," he said softly. "You restored a family." Claire lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the compliment. "I only noticed what love had been trying to protect all along." Nathaniel slowly picked up the porcelain coffee cup beside the letter and raised it slightly, not as a toast to success but to memory itself. Around him the family gathered closer to one another than they had in years, sharing stories instead of valuations, laughter instead of opinions about inheritance. Claire watched quietly from the edge of the room, no longer feeling like an outsider looking into someone else's history. For the first time in many years, she accepted that kindness sometimes returns not as recognition, but as belonging, and as the afternoon sunlight settled gently across the portrait, the watch, the letter, and the smiling faces beneath them, it became impossible to tell which heirloom had truly been the most valuable, because every heart in the room had become part of the inheritance. Several months later, the seasons had quietly changed, yet some mornings at Ashford House still felt wonderfully familiar. The same polished windows welcomed the sunrise. The same porcelain coffee cups warmed waiting hands. The same old photograph near the entrance greeted every guest who stepped inside, its wooden frame now cared for by more than one employee because Claire's quiet habit had slowly become everyone else's. She arrived wearing her familiar dark blue winter coat against the cool autumn air before tying on her black apron, with the calm confidence of someone who no longer carried every kindness alone. Nathaniel Brooks visited nearly every Saturday, never announcing himself, never requesting special treatment, always choosing the table beside the window where the afternoon light gently reached the dining room first. He no longer brought heirlooms to admire. Instead, he brought family members, one at a time, sharing stories that had almost disappeared before finding their way home again. On this particular morning, his youngest granddaughter carried the silver pocket watch carefully in both hands before placing it beside a fresh bouquet of blue forget-me-nots in a small display case created inside Brooks Manor. It was no longer presented as the family's most valuable possession. A handwritten card simply read, "Remember the people before you remember the object." Claire smiled quietly when Nathaniel showed her a photograph of the display. Beside the watch rested Eleanor Brooks's portrait, the restored family letter, and several old photographs that children now loved asking about during every family gathering. Nathaniel folded the photograph carefully before placing it beside the coffee cup. "My grandchildren know their great-grandmother's stories now," he said softly. "They know her laughter before they know her jewelry." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment, feeling a warmth she had spent years believing she should never expect from life. "Then the heirloom found its purpose again," she answered. Nathaniel shook his head gently. "No, we did." They shared a quiet smile that needed no explanation. When it was time to leave, Nathaniel reached for the receipt and paused. Years earlier, he would have measured the meal by its price. Now he studied the small piece of paper as though it represented something far greater. He wrote a short note beneath his signature before folding it once and leaving it beneath the empty coffee cup. After he walked out into the crisp afternoon sunlight, Claire returned to clear the table. She lifted the cup and found only 5 handwritten words. "Thank you for helping us remember." She held the receipt gently between her fingers before slipping it inside the small wooden keepsake box waiting at home beside her grandparents' photograph. Not because it was expensive or rare, but because it had become part of a story worth preserving. That evening, Aunt Margaret smiled when Claire quietly placed the receipt beside the old family letters. "Another heirloom?" she asked with kind eyes. Claire looked toward the fading autumn light beyond the window and nodded softly. "Not because of the paper," she said, "because of the promise it carries." Outside, the leaves drifted slowly across the quiet street while families gathered around dinner tables throughout the neighborhood. Somewhere across town, Nathaniel wound the silver pocket watch before placing it beneath his grandmother's portrait exactly where it belonged. Neither of them had changed the past. Neither had erased loneliness or regret. But together they had done something gentler. They had reminded 2 families that love survives longest when it is remembered, that dignity asks for nothing in return, and that the greatest inheritance any person can leave behind is a heart that teaches another heart how to be kind.